this is what we used to produce in the rent register for the North Lane Traders Association. So we would produce a floor plan of the building, showing where all the zones are, and then we would show all the working out for how we've arrived at right at the bottom, the ITZA of the entire building, and the rent that is being paid per square foot in terms of Zone A. And that used to go to the tenant, and he used to then take that to the landlord and say, well, this is what I think I should be paying, and here's the evidence, and here's the proof. And 9 times out of 10, the landlord would say, well, okay, it looks like you know what you're talking about. Even surveyors would actually say, okay, let's talk, because quite clearly this shows that you know what you're doing, that you're not an innocent. Now, what happens if you can't agree? It's a very good question, and very often, because this is not, it's an inexact science. You know, precedents are set, but they needn't necessarily be set in stone. There may be conflicting evidence. There may be one lease renewal in the street that's £50 a square foot, and another one within a few months of each other that's 30. You know, in the end, it's a question of compromise. Now, your lease will have a procedure in it that tells you what happens if you can't agree. And generally, it's one of two things. It will either go to arbitration, or it will go to an independent expert. But it will say that in the lease, which one it is. If it goes to arbitration, it will be by a third party. So you will agree upon an independent surveyor that will look at your evidence and the evidence of your landlord, and his decision will be binding. If you can't agree on an independent surveyor, then the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors will appoint one, and you'll have no choice. You'll just be given a name. Then that decision will be binding. If you still can't agree, or you can't come to arbitration, then it'll go to court. In the final analysis, it goes to court, and a judge will look at the evidence. If it's a lease renewal and you can't agree, then it always goes to court, and it goes to the High Court. And you want to avoid that like the plague, because it's hugely expensive. Anything to do with going to court is hugely expensive, as I'm sure you'll testify. If you can, you want to do it by negotiation. Now, avoid the following pitfalls. Your lease will have in it a specific window of opportunity in order to start the review process. And if you miss it, and it's normally about 6 months, within 6 months of the review period, if you miss it, then you may well find that you've lost your rights to negotiate. So you've got to look at the lease and make sure that you are contacting your landlord within that time period to say, I understand that I have a lease renewal, I await your proposal with interest, or I have appointed such and such to represent me. So you're marking the card that you are aware that there is a rent review or a lease renewal, and you're basically saying, I'm starting the process within the terms of my lease. Don't let it run on past the lease renewal date or the review date, because if you do, you could lose your rights. You could do. And also, if it's a review, you might think, oh, blimey, times are tight. This is going to be a dreadful year. I don't really want to risk having a rent review and an increase in rent in 2011 because it's going to be tough. And the landlord hasn't contacted me, so I just let it run. And 2 years later, in 2013, when the economy's picked up and everything's booming, the landlord will come back and say, no, that lease renewal that's 2 years out of date, let's talk about it now. And of course, all the evidence is far better now than it was then. Technically, only evidence from the review date 2 years previously should be admissible. But actually, you may well find that difficult to come across. And also, your landlord could argue, okay, so 2 years ago the situation was this, but look what's happened since. Look at the direction of travel of rents in the area since. Obviously they've gone up, things have got better. So it's always better to do it at the time. Don't accept whatever the landlord says, because very often landlords will say, I know it's been tough, so I'll tell you what, I won't ask you for 10, I'll just ask you for 8,000. Or I won't ask you for 20, I'll just ask you for 12. It seems like wonderful generosity, but actually you don't know whether it's good, bad or indifferent. And if possible, get professional representation. If you can afford it, then go to a commercial surveyor and get represented. It will cost you money. It will probably cost you between 5 and 10% of the final rent agreed. Now people always say, if a surveyor is going to charge me 5 to 10% of the final rent agreed, then surely the incentive is for him to agree the rent as high as possible so that he gets more commission. You have to rely on their professionalism. You know, you have to. You could do yourself a favour and look for surveyors that tend to represent tenants more than landlords. There are instances of the same surveyor representing a tenant on one side of the street and a landlord on the other. And they would argue evidence is evidence. So it doesn't matter that I'm representing, you know, the gamekeeper on one side and the poacher on the other. It doesn't make any difference because evidence is evidence.
Would you say, as quite a few said in the room, like myself, that we're all sitting here with dead leases at the moment, and do you think that's why probably our agents, for our landlords, are actually letting us blow in the wind because they're going to take advantage of that in the end?
I wouldn't say they're going to take advantage of it, but certainly, if you're a landlord, this is a very good year to let that lease renewal or that review just drift on. Because 2011 is going to be a really tough year. There's going to be a lot of shops closing. We've already seen Sussex Stationers going, HMV in Western Road. There's going to be more of that. And quite clearly, that will drive rents down. Now, the problem with the rent review process is that there's a bit of a lag. You know, it could drive rents down. HMV could stand empty for 18 months, so Sussex Stationers could disappear altogether. But it will take 6 months, 9 months, 12 months for that to actually affect rents and drive them down. So in many ways, you know, you might find that the evidence isn't there, it just isn't there. But we have got empty shops, and that's a material fact. You know, that this is a tough year, and landlords know it. You know, landlords must know that they're lucky to have a tenant, to be honest. Right, one of the things that the landlord might suggest to you is that you phase the rent. So you've got a 5-year rent review period. You're paying £20,000. He might say to you, look, over the 5-year period, you're now paying £20,000. I'll increase it by £2,000 each year. So it's easier for you to handle. Not 10 grand all in one lump, because that's really difficult. Let's just do it by a couple of £1,000s each year, and as the economy recovers, you know, it won't be such a burden on you. The problem is, and often that's a very good deal. You know, if you actually don't have 10 grand extra, that's quite a good deal. But the problem is that at the next rent review, the starting point is £30,000. The fact that, you know, the average, if you like, across that 5-year period isn't £30,000, it's actually 26. You know, if you spread out that 10 grand increase over the 5 years, but actually the starting point is the last rent you pay, which will be £30,000. So at the end of 5 years, immediately you will be looking at that's the starting point. You're not going to get any less than that. So if you can, avoid that phasing. If you can't, make it as small as possible. Don't do it by £2,000 a year, do it by £1,000 a year. So when you get to the end of that rent review period, the starting point is £25,000, not £30,000. Or avoid it altogether. Personal concessions. Your lease will almost certainly say that the rent review is upward only, it can never go down. If you're lucky, it can stay the same. Actually, in reality, landlords will often make personal concessions for a good tenant. In other words, private landlords in particular, you're probably not going to get much of a personal concession from a pension company or sort of one of these big insurance institutions that seem to own a lot of property. Prudential Property Management that own most of a big block in North Street are probably not going to give you a personal concession because, to be honest, you're too small for it. You know, it's not in their interests. But if you've got a private landlord, then it's in his interests to keep you as a tenant because this is his income. The rent that you pay is the income that he lives off, and he doesn't want to have a void. He doesn't want to have a period where that shop's empty and he doesn't get any income. Now, you can, if you want, just blag it. You just go to him and say, I can't pay the rent. You know, do you think you can give me a bit of a reduction? But actually, the landlord probably isn't a fool for that. He's going to want to know that you can't pay the rent. And he's going to want to see certain things. One of them is your accounts for last year, to show what you did last year. And then he's going to see comparable figures for this year. So you can see how much your takings have actually declined by. If you can come up with evidence from other people in the street as well, that's even better. So it shows it's not just you because you're no good at running your business. It's actually the economy that is driving down your takings. This year that shouldn't be difficult, to be honest. He's probably going to see a cash flow forecast to show that at some point in the future you're going to run out of money and you're not going to be able to pay the rent. You're going to be out of business. But not tomorrow. It's no good going to the landlord and saying, look, here's my cash flow forecast, it's January. By February, I'm bust. Because it shows that actually it's not a very good way to run a business. You want to project forward so that you're going to your landlord 3, 4, 5, 6 months before you actually get to the point where you're broke. Because if he thinks you're going to be broke tomorrow, what's the point of him giving you a rent reduction? He should actually be looking for another tenant, not looking to give you a rent reduction. And then evidence of what else you've done. What else have you done to save money so that you can still continue to pay the rent? You know, have you cut staff? Have you increased your opening hours? Have you cut down some overhead? What have you actually done? So it shows that you're making an effort. And the way to pitch it is that this is a partnership. You and he are in a partnership. And he wants to keep that partnership going because it's in his interests. Obviously it's in yours, but it's in his interests just as much. Whether or not you'll get that, what will make the difference is basically how long you've been a tenant. So if you've been a tenant for 6 months, he probably won't give you a personal concession. He'll probably look around for another tenant. If you've been a tenant for 20 years and you've always paid your rent, you've got a good record, well then he's going to believe you when you say, listen, I'm falling on tough times. And then also, what's in the local and national news? So if the economy's buoyant, but you aren't, he's probably not going to want to give you a rent reduction. This year is a great year to ask for a personal concession. And then examples of shops closing. If you can literally give your landlord examples of shops around you that are closed, that have gone out of business, then that will really sort of concentrate the mind, if you like, particularly if he's a private landlord. If you do get a personal concession, it will almost certainly be an individual arrangement with you and you alone. So in other words, if you get a personal concession to reduce your rent by, say, £5,000, and you then sell your lease, that concession will not apply to the next person. And he will almost certainly ask you to keep it confidential, because he won't want, if he's got other properties, he won't want people to know that he's giving away concessions. And also, he might have other properties in the same street where he doesn't want to give away concessions.